Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Beatrice and today I have a bit of a different video for you. This one is not going to be about Jane Austen or about literature really, but it's going to be rather about the concept of theological aesthetics. Now before we get into all that, you might have noticed that the library behind me has come back from my earlier videos, from some of the first videos I made, and hopefully this will be my new background for the foreseeable future as we've moved into a new home. So you should get used to the bookcase behind me because it's hopefully here to stay. Now, I have for a long time been interested in the idea of beauty. When we see a painting or a beautiful landscape, or even when we read a book, why do we think of it as beautiful? Why do we hear a song and say this is a beautiful song? What is the standard, basically, by which we judge nature or works of art? I've also been interested for a long time in religion and theology, as you will have guessed if you watched my previous videos. So today I'm trying to combine those two interests and offer you a brief introduction to this idea of theological aesthetics, or theoaesthetics for short. Let's start with the obvious question, which is, what is theological aesthetics? Well, aesthetics itself is the philosophical study of beauty and taste. It asks questions about what we find beautiful and about why we find it beautiful. Theological aesthetics is the discipline that basically combines theology and aesthetics. This means that it asks questions about how our five senses and our perception of works of art can inform our understanding of God. Or on the other hand, it can also ask questions about how our understanding of God can inform our aesthetic tastes. So what's interesting to me is that once we approach aesthetics theologically, we can see that our understanding of God can actually shape quite deeply what we find and don't find beautiful. And this is a really vast discipline to study, but for today I think it would be really helpful to introduce this concept by asking one question, which is, how does the Christian faith specifically affect our aesthetic tastes? If it is true that our understanding of God and our taste in beauty, our ideas of beauty, are somehow connected, then how does the Christian faith particularly shape this connection? Why does it make a difference? I first started thinking about this question of the Christian faith shaping our aesthetic tastes when I took a class on medieval theology taught by a wonderful professor called Sister Anselm when I was doing some graduate studies. And in this class we went through reading the whole Revelations of Divine Love by which is a 14th century book of mysticism by Julian of Norwich. And in the Revelations, Julian recounts a series of visions that she has, many of which involve seeing Christ on the cross, so Christ's suffering and his death. Julian repeatedly describes the crucified Christ as at once beautiful but also physically distorted and damaged by pain, as you would expect it to be. And here is where our instructor, Sister Anne, noted that the Christian ideal of beauty actually vastly differs from the previous standard of beauty in ancient Greek civilization. And I thought this was really interesting, so I started thinking about it more. The Greek ideal of beauty has to do with harmony and proportion. This means that, at least when it comes to representing the human body, it's all about physical perfection and health. Just think about all the beautiful ancient Greek statues that you would have seen in museums, or various replicas of them that you would have seen that were made later in the during the Roman times. But when Christianity comes around, a big change happens. Suddenly you start to get Christian visual art, which persists for centuries and centuries, which represents Christ's death on the cross, or also things like the violent deaths of Christian martyrs. And yet, we don't consider this kind of art to be ugly, even though it depicts physical suffering and shows the human body in a state of hurt and pain rather than physical health. With all of this in mind, I found a book on my husband's bookshelf, which I started reading as I was thinking more about theological aesthetics, with this question of how is Christian art different from ancient Greek or Roman art in mind. And this book is called The Portal of Beauty by Bruno Forte, who is an Italian theologian and I believe archbishop. In this book, Forte discusses what some key thinkers over the centuries have understood to be beautiful within the context of the Christian faith. I won't go through all of them today because there are too many, but I want to present to you a few examples, basically as springboards for further discussion and reflection on this. The chapter I was most struck by in this book was actually the first chapter, which is on St. Augustine. For Augustine, Forte explains, beauty is essentially God. God is beauty. It is being able to see the wholeness of God and the wholeness of his creation in the individual fragment of creation. And this means that beauty is not just what looks perfect, but rather, he says, even beauty's opposites, such as pain or deformity, can be beautiful. And this is because all things work together towards the harmony planned by the supreme artificer, that is, by God. The point is that even pain can be beautiful, although it shouldn't be glorified by any means, but you can still see the beauty in someone's pain, as in the paintings of Christian martyrs, because it can be a sacrificial, it can be an example of someone acting sacrificially, essentially, of imitating Christ in his own suffering on the cross. And this reminded me of one of the other medieval theologians that I studied in the class I mentioned, that is Anselm of Canterbury. In his work called Cor Deus Homo, Anselm is trying to explain why God had to become man in Christ, through Christ, in order to redeem humanity. Why couldn't he have done it any other way? And one of the concepts that Anselm goes to constantly in his book is this idea of what he calls fittingness, which is the idea that there is something beautiful and harmonious about how God decided to save humanity, which is through the incarnation of his Son. And again, this involves suffering. Christ knew he would be killed and willingly decided to endure the torture on the cross because he wanted to save humanity and because he wanted us to fully accept him as God. And even in this, there is beauty because it still belongs to God's greater plan of redeeming humanity. Now, jumping several centuries ahead from medieval figures to much later figures that Bruno Forte discusses, another chapter which I found really, really insightful was the one on 19th century Russian novelist Dostoyevsky. And Forte argues that Dostoyevsky had a keen sense of the tragic quality of the human condition and wrote really acutely and really brilliantly on how the Christian faith invites us to find beauty in tragedy. So that's a really interesting link, because we might be tempted to think of beauty as everything that goes well and is healthy and is perfect, but no, Dostoyevsky would say there is beauty in tragedy, in tragic situations. Once we realize how much suffering there is in the world, we may be tempted to turn to nihilism. But instead, Forte explains, for Dostoyevsky, only from the darkness of Good Friday, where God suffers and dies out of love of the world, it is possible to proclaim the victory of life and beauty, because that death is the death of death. Let me read the last bit again, because it's easy to miss what he's trying to say, but it's really beautiful. So the idea is that only from the darkness of Good Friday, which involves God's suffering through Christ for our salvation, is it possible to proclaim the victory of life and beauty, because that death, so Christ's death, is the death of death. So beauty is tragic for this novelist, but that doesn't mean that tragedy lasts forever, right? There is still hope and redemption in Christ's sacrifice on the cross, and that is actually where the idea of beauty is to be found. It's not just in suffering itself, but it's in this kind of sacrificial suffering that doesn't have to involve physical perfection and health. It involves a love that accepts sacrifice and pain. And Forte also makes a similar argument about 20th century theologian Balthazar, emphasizing God in human form, that is Christ incarnated as a human, and this is what embodies the idea of beauty, basically. So Forte says that for Balthazar, it is the revelation of Christ which manifests beauty. In the crucified and risen one, beauty offers itself as the whole in the fragment. So again, we get this idea of the entirety of God's splendor in the fragment of one single person, of Jesus Christ, who is just one human being and yet represents the beauty and the splendor of God, despite just being one person. So as you can see, one can make a pretty convincing case that Christianity actually substantially changed the way that we think about beauty and expanded it to include suffering and imperfection. And this feels pretty revolutionary to me and has implications for how we see those among us who are more vulnerable, who are more dependent, those who are physically maimed for whatever reason. This is a pretty substantial change in mindset, and one that means that over the centuries we have valued essentially placing all people on the same level of equality with each other, in a way that perhaps we could say what wasn't there before, because we can still find people beautiful and worthy of being loved who are not necessarily in perfect physical health, or for whatever reason who are in pain and who are suffering. So that's a pretty big change from pre-Christian societies, which would definitely not have seen a lack of physical health as still being able to be beautiful. But what about you? What are some of your assumptions about what beauty is? If you think about the word, what comes to mind? What is your idea of beauty? What are your kind of tastes in art? And how do you think that those ideas that you have about beauty have come about? Where do you think your ideas about beauty come from, essentially? I would be really curious to hear that. And especially if you're someone who is a practicing Christian or believes in God more generally, but you belong to a different faith tradition, I'm really curious to hear how works of art might have shaped your beliefs, and on the other hand, how your faith might have actually shaped what you perceive to be beautiful. So let me know in the comments about that. I'm really curious to hear from other people. I think I will pause here for today, just because I did promise a short introduction and this is already getting quite long. But if this sounds interesting to you, please let me know, because I would love to talk more about theoaesthetics on this channel, either as a concept in and of itself or applied to a discussion of a particular work of art or theology or literature. And as my thoughts will develop, I will have more to say about this as well. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you in my next video, which will hopefully be very soon. I will be having a baby in a few weeks' time, so if the schedule on this channel changes as it did when I had my son, then you know that that's why. But in the meantime, enjoy my my normal video routine for as long as it lasts. Have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you soon.